amendments to Inshore Safety, so to do with the sea and the harbours in Jersey. So we've got a number of questions for you on this issue. I'm going to just introduce myself and the panel. So I'm Deputy Montfort-Taddy, I'm the chair of this panel.
I am Deputy Max Andrews and I'm a panel member.
And if you can introduce yourselves for the record, please.
Deputy Kirsten, Morel, Minister for Sustainable Economic Development.
Deputy Morel, Hegarat, Minister for Justice and Home Affairs.
Chief Inspector Craig Jackson, States Jersey Police, on behalf of the Chief Officer. Good afternoon.
Bill Sadler, Jersey Harbourmaster.
Thank you.
Lydia Irving, Sector Officer for Maritime in the Department for the Economy.
Thank you. Welcome. So I'm just going to get on with our questions. So first of all, could you just, and I'll put this to the Minister for SED initially, but of course, Minister, if you think there are individuals here who need a better place to answer to, but otherwise we'll proceed on that basis.
Thank you.
Could you begin by explaining the primary objectives of the Draft Harbours Inshore Safety Amendment regulations that you're putting forward in P3, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're pleased to. So the main aim is to strengthen the island's maritime legal framework, making our territorial waters safer for everyone to use. And as a result of that, it's also increasing penalties for individuals found guilty of causing harm to others within them. And it's also, Chair, you mentioned the road traffic law earlier in the preamble. It's also to introduce comparable offences to the road traffic law 1956 as far as is practicable. So that's the kind of main overview. I don't know if you want me to drill down into more specifics about the regulations.
That's fine for now, and we will come back to maybe looking at the comparisons between the road traffic law. So one question I've got, so currently these amendments being put forward are amending a parent law, if I can call it that, which is the Harbours Inshore Safety Jersey Regulations 2012. So I suppose the question is, what's wrong with that law, or what's insufficient in it that it needs amending?
Yeah, so a number of incidents over the past few years have kind of highlighted a few areas of the current law which we'd see as deficient. One of them is a range of new offences for the dangerous and careless operation of a vessel, including where someone is seriously injured or killed. And that includes aggravated offences when drink or drugs are used. Another one is to include powers for the police and the Harbourmaster to breathalyse people who they have reasonable cause to suspect may be under an influence of alcohol during the course of an investigation into that careless operation of a vessel. And those are kind of the main deficiencies. I don't know if there's something else.
I think that's right. So I think the current regulations have two primary offences in terms of operating a vessel without due care and attention and recklessly. Now, we've had a number of prosecutions under due care and attention, one under recklessly. Recklessly was very tricky to prove, or very hard to get that, what is termed reckless. By replacing without due care and attention and recklessly with careless and dangerous, I think the definitions are much tighter. I think when you read the definitions, they read well. And if you were a novice boater or even experienced boater, I think you can read these and be clear what careless and dangerous means. So it replaced those two regulations. As the Minister identified, it allows us to be able to proportionally breathalyse. So it doesn't give us the right to start going around and randomly breathalysing people. But on the grounds that we believe someone's operated a boat carelessly, that does allow us the grounds, if we suspect alcohol is involved, to be able to breathalyse someone. And again, it allows us to actually formally be able to breathalyse someone. At the moment, we've had to rely on people volunteering to, which quite often people do actually, but it does give us the powers to be able to do that.
In terms of, it was very interesting just hearing you speak there, because I just wanted to really touch on the part that you mentioned about carelessness. And would that be, say, for instance, if somebody is in charge of the boat and they maybe hand the reins over to somebody else who's maybe got no experience, would that be something that you would consider to be careless or not?
It is quite open, so I think it's been quite well written. So a person who operates a ship or in territorial waters without due care and attention or without reasonable consideration for other people. So it's without that reason. So I guess these will be decisions for officers to make when case files are presented. But the idea that potentially you've got a boat with a number of people on board and you've got a 6-year-old, I mean, using an extreme example, a 6-year-old driving it, and the parent is happily doing that. I mean, there may well be an insurance offence there anyway, which will be covered by these regulations. You're required to have third-party insurance. But I think that potentially would be something which would raise the eyebrows of the duty officer and would need investigating. And it could well fall under careless, but that would be a decision ultimately by law officers whether that goes forward as a prosecution.
Okay.
Thank you. So, yeah, I think that's helpful. So in terms, what you're saying is up to now. So, for example, Article 9 of the current law talks about recklessness. I think 9A and B part talks about dangerous in a manner that's dangerous to other people. Are you saying that that's too vague?
Yes.
Actually, and there have been problems with prosecutions because of that?
So we've had, actually, our last prosecution we did actually get reckless for, and that was an example of somebody riding jet ski deliberately at a paddleboarder, and we had very good phone evidence of that, and we actually got an admission of reckless actually in the end of the magistrate's cause. But there was always a slight nervousness around the term reckless. I think careless and dangerous are understood in terms of boats and cars are similar but different. But I think in the context of this, we're using similar language in the road traffic law. But again, I think the definitions, when you read them, are. I would hope that if you were, even as a novice boater, you'd be able to recognise.
I think, if I may, I think that, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there have been instances in the past where the prosecution has shied away from going for reckless because it's more difficult to pin down, and therefore has gone just for careless as a result. So I think there have been potential prosecutions which could have been at a high level but weren't taken. I think that's correct.
When we look at prosecutions, we are, as a Harbour Authority, we're here to enforce these regulations. We're sworn in as centenniers. We've got a responsibility. Prosecution is normally a last resort. It's where we've got people who are, consciously being incompetent, deliberately going out. The case of the jet ski is a good example of that, but deliberately going out their way to breach regulations. In the first instance, we're trying to use education and, encourage responsible boating, but there do need to be penalties of operating vessels in the incorrect manner. And again, I think this just strengthens the regulatory framework around it.
So you're sworn in as centenniers so that you can prosecute, is that right?
So we have centennier powers in relation to the regulations I'm responsible, as do the acting Harbourmasters. So we take an oath in the Royal Court. So all our duty officers who are on call, they are in the law acting Harbourmasters and are sworn in as centenniers. And
so do they have to be attached to a particular parish?
No. So how it works is if the offence is committed within a particular parish, it's the parish centennier which brings prosecution. It's in territorial waters, it's St Helier. Ordinarily, we'll tend to use the law officers and put a case file that way. And so again, just as a point of interest, if it's in the high seas on the Jersey registered vessel, it's also the parish of St Helier, which is just a bit of a uniqueness of.
Can I just ask, in terms of there being contested disputes that are very difficult to actually enforce, have you been aware of such cases, and if so, how prominent have those cases been?
No, so I think, be really honest, and we've got some stats here.
Yeah.
The compliance around our local boating is actually very good. We have a low amount of incidents, and it's a very small minority of people who deliberately go out their way to operate their boats, either carelessly or dangerously. We haven't ever successfully, we've never failed to seek a prosecution or to get a successful prosecution when we've gone to prosecution. But there's always been that teetering of between without due care and attention and recklessly.
Yeah, thank you.
Minister.
I was just going to say what might be helpful to you is that if you look at the Road Traffic Jersey Law 1956, there has been changes over the last probably 15 to 20 years in relation to particular offences. So, because dangerous was always quite difficult to prosecute, to be able to get the evidence to prove dangerous. And so there have been additional offences off the top of my head, things like to do with alcohol. So if you look at the Road Traffic Jersey Law, over time, it's actually increased in its ability to be able to prosecute those serious offences. That's probably the best way of putting it, isn't it?
That's correct. It's bringing in the serious injury by driving carelessly or without due care and consideration, where we didn't have previously. We had to rely on a death by dangerous driving. Okay. Now the new amendments bring in a death by driving without due care and attention, which is obviously a lower reckless act compared to proving that higher threshold. So, for example, restriction on telephones, holding a telephone whilst driving, that's one of the new additional That was always been holding a mobile phone whilst vehicle is in motion, but obviously they're the aggravating factors that you look at within the investigation, whether the way the person was driving, whether it
Wasn't there in
constituted
1956 though? Is what
No,
I mean.
no,
No,
I'll
but it
t-
was with the amendments that came
yeah,
through.
that amendment, you have driving without due care and attention.
Yeah.
And by using a mobile phone, that could be considered to be driving without due care and attention. But again, in the same principle as what I just said,
Yeah.
and obviously Craig as well, is that became more difficult and challenging to prove in a court. So that's why the actual holding of a mobile phone became a standalone offence, so that you could actually deal with that matter and not have to prove the nature of somebody's driving whilst they were actually holding the phone. Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense, yeah. So I mean, we may come to this later, but it's been mentioned already by Captain Sadler about the aggravated nature of alcohol. It could be drugs as well, but let's stick to alcohol for now. So when you said testing is going to be made available, you have to. There already has to be a suspicion that another offence has been committed, an offence of driving without due care, operating without.
Sorry, careless or dangerous.
Careless or dangerous.
Yes.
So that's got to be proven first before a breath test can be
I think
asked for.
there's got to be, yes, the duty officer has to believe that the vessel has been operated that way. It doesn't have to be proven. So so if there's a suspicion it is. Yeah. I think we'll just go back to the definition of careless. I think the threshold is actually quite low. Again, I think the bit which really sticks out is that without reasonable consideration for other people, and it's. So that could be anything from, I can give you some examples of what the vast majority of our enforcement are, if I'm honest. So we've got a set of it's here within our stats, we've got a set of lights at the pier head called the ILO lights, and it's vessels running through those lights, and it's generally speeding within places like St. Bernard's Bay, where we've got the 5-knot speed limit, or down the small roads. Okay. If you're speeding or running the red light, you've operated that vessel carelessly. Now, most of the time, what we find is when we speak to those people, it's unconscious. They're being unconsciously incompetent. So we didn't really understand what the rules were. You have a word with them. They're explained to them. But the duty officer comes down and he can smell alcohol. At the moment, he's in a tricky position in terms of, we've previously asked people to, will you volunteer to have a breath test? But quite a lot of people will agree to that. Otherwise, we're really reliant on sometimes calling the States of Jersey police, and they'll sometimes provide us a statement that they believe the person may be intoxicated, and the magistrate will take that into account sometimes. But this does, it's quite a low threshold, and I think
in the new law.
In the new law, yes, to allow us to be able to breathalyse.
But I think the point I'm getting at is that the breathalyser, you need to breathalyse if you suspect that there's been another offence committed. So
yes.
Breathalysing can't be a way to prove that the other offence has been committed. It's an aggravating offence.
Correct.
So, for example, in that situation where somebody's speeding in to the pier head,
yep.
you breathalyse them. They pass the breath test, so they haven't
yep.
been consuming excessively. There should still be an offence that's prosecutable there, which is the
potentially on that one there'll be a couple of offences.
Do you expect that in that scenario that the offence would still have legs if they haven't been drinking?
Yes. So, and again, I think it's proportionate as well. So if the duty officer comes down and it's, for example, I'm not going to pick on the French deliberately, but sometimes we get French boats come in and they're less familiar with the local geography and how things work. And he comes down and they have a word and they have, gone 7 knots through the speed limit and perhaps gone through the red lights into the harbour. As long as that conversation and they take on board the words of advice, we'll log it in the system. Yeah. Wouldn't necessarily take that forward to prosecution. It wouldn't be in the public interest to do so, but it will be recorded. Yeah. We then have another escalation. We issue a Harbourmaster's warning, which is the first level. This is in our public enforcement policy, so we have a published public enforcement policy. And the Harbourmaster's warning stays on record for 3 years.
Okay.
You get a second Harbourmaster's warning. That's when we really do start thinking about prosecution. Reoffending on Harbourmaster's warnings at 1.8%. It's very low. So, again, I think if you've run the red lights or you've sped down the small roads and you've been drinking, that is an aggregate. That's almost that's a ticket to, that's almost a pathway to prosecution.
I suppose what I'm getting at is that the decision's been made, I think, either consciously or in absence of an active decision to prosecute operating a vessel under the influence of alcohol in its own right. So it's not an offence to operate a vessel under the influence of alcohol, is it?
in itself, no.
No.
There has to be cause too.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that the fact that somebody might have been drinking, that doesn't affect whether or not the underlying offence has been committed or not. It just aggravates it.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. That's fine. So it's just to get that point on record. So we may come back to that point afterwards when we do the compare and contrast. Good. Thanks for that. I'll just continue. So why was the decision taken not to make it a provision for alcohol and drug testing to be carried out if there was a suspicion? Well, actually, I think this question has been answered because it's not an offence. So I won't answer that one. Minister, what information do you receive on accidents that are recorded in Jersey's territorial waters, and what do you do with this information?
So I'm provided with reports on accidents of a significant nature. So there are plenty of incidents such as going through the red light, etc., which I don't receive reports about at all. But if there's accidents where there's been damage or there's been damage to people, then I will often usually get the report on.
So both within the Inshore Safety regulations and within the shipping law, there are mandatory reports which must be made to the minister. If it's all right, so I think the other thing we do is that during the harbour, we have something called the Harbour and Airport Committee. So the Ports of Jersey is the harbour authority, and there's a subcommittee of the board. So after, or either just before or just after every harbour authority and airport committee meeting, I'll meet with the minister. We go through the pack of that, and it's the harbour authority I'm reporting to in terms of my enforcement powers, and then the minister receives the same briefing as either just before or just after.
I mean, there's like you asked as well, Chair. What do I do with that? If you know what I mean, like you say, it's a report to me. There's nothing further for me to do following that, unless there may be an individual instance, but I've not come across that so far.
Sadler, just before you mentioned about if somebody was to reoffend, and I just want to know whether there have been instances where people have been reoffending during your stint in your current position.
Yeah, so the reoffendment rate is and I don't know whether the stats, do you provide the stats of Scrutiny, will they just for internal briefing?
No, but we can provide them.
Okay. So over the last 5 years, I think it's one reoffence on the Harbourmaster's warning, and that did lead to a prosecution.
Okay.
And there were kind of different, there was a multitude of things to do with the vessel and the person.
Yeah. And I just wanted to know as well, do you get many French vessels coming to Jersey, and if so, are the rules different in France compared to Jersey?
Yeah, so I think there's, broadly speaking, international maritime legislation is the same. So the international rules on the prevention collision are the same, but there are nuances, I would say, in terms of things like speed limits and stuff. So yeah, we on average we get 6,000 visiting boats a year to St Helier.
Okay.
That's everything from lots of UK sailors, but lots and lots of French sailors, but also Americans and all sorts of things. Every sailor should be, before they come, reading local notice of marriage and making themselves aware of the particularities of that port. So if I go to Granville or Carteret my boat, I'll make sure that I have a look at what the local rules and regulations are. But yeah, we do have some incidents every now and again where French boats will run a red light or don't quite understand not just the French, to be fair.
But I think, as Deputy, I think that does touch on something which is quite an important part of these regulations, is because somebody may finish their journey in Jersey, but they didn't necessarily start their journey in Jersey, and that is also something that's in your mind when you're deciding how much you want to copy the road traffic law, if you know what I mean. The road traffic law, the offences start and stop in Jersey.
Yes.
In the shipping or the Inshore Safety law, they don't necessarily start and stop in Jersey.
No.
So in the sense that you could be in one jurisdiction where the law is slightly different, but finish in this jurisdiction.
Yeah.
It is one reason to potentially have differences to the road traffic law.
Yeah. Okay.
You have to carry on with them.
Yes, yep, sure, yeah, no, most certainly. I was wondering whether you could actually provide the panel with some of the figures that you spoke about before.
Anything, I don't know.
Any particular figures?
Yes, I would look.
Yes, so this is to do more so with incidents where alcohol or drugs have been consumed.
Yeah, so we did have a look at that. So there were, in the last 5 years, there were 40 incidents where there were no mentions of drugs, but there were 14 incidents where alcohol was mentioned within the incident report.
Yeah.
One very specifically, which went to the magistrate's court, where we had a statement from the police where it was suspected. Again, that was used as an aggravating. The magistrate did use it as an aggravating factor when doing the sentence. Within those, there was a combination of people who mainly commercial operators, have had an incident and then volunteered, basically come ashore and said, I'd like to be breath tested because, you know, their professional reputation, they want to rule it out.
Yeah.
A couple where we had suspicion, but we weren't able to follow through, and that's a weakness in the that was a weakness in the regulation. But yeah, so kind of 14 broad incidents in terms of, but they include, you know, a handful of people who kind of volunteered to be.
Yeah. And what happens in the case where, for instance, there might be a boat collision between two parties, and it might be contestable, and they disagree on what happened? What do you usually do from an enforcement perspective when that happens?
So I think there are different types of collision. So we have the kind of, you know, the very sad fatal collision at sea where you have a commercial vessel, you know, and there is, you know, catastrophic damage and loss of life.
Yeah.
And then you have what I would call, you know, bumps in the harbour. So bumps in the harbour generally, they're recorded on an incident system, and it's normally an insurance issue. We actually have very few, thankfully.
Yeah.
There are two notable incidents in my time as Harbourmaster. One is the tragic incident which happened in St Wands with the Lacombe and the Commodore Goodwill, and the other one was in St Blards Bay with a jet ski and a speedboat, which is why actually this is a bit the genesis of these regulations go back to, was the inclusion of the serious injury and death.
Yeah.
The serious injury wasn't in the previous regulations, and of course that person was seriously injured, and all we really managed to get as prosecution was without due care and attention. I think it would have been, under these set of regulations, we would have been in a much stronger position, but they're the two notable incidents.
Yeah.
So the starting point, I mean, the starting point, both in terms of Jersey, but also the fact that we're not dealing with cars and roads here, is that there's no requirement for anybody operating a leisure vessel in Jersey to have any kind of qualification or training to do that, is there?
Correct.
And it is, when you talked about France earlier, are there different standards in Europe, for example, about who can take a vessel out?
Yeah, so there are different standards in different countries. So France does have a minimum requirement for some stuff. UK has none, so we very much reflect the UK in that. Again, we wear lots of different hats in Ports of Jersey, so as much as I'm sitting here as the Harbourmaster and talking about enforcement, I'm also the Chief Coast Guard and responsible for sea safety. We put a lot of effort into education, and I think we can be really proud, generally speaking, of our local boat owners. We've got great yacht clubs, we've got great sailing clubs, we engage with youngsters early. We don't have a lot of what I would call true antisocial behaviour in boats. It does happen, and the duty officer gets called out to noisy jet skis, jet skis which are worrying people. But generally speaking, I think, again, regulations need to be proportionate to the level of risk which has been presented. At the moment, I think we've got a very compliant local boating community. We manage to police with consent with them, so we're not hopefully not overbearing and over-exercising our powers as a harbour authority. I think it gets very complicated in terms of qualifications. I think at the moment, a lot of the local marine traders, when they sell a boat, they offer a powerboat level 2 course or whatever it is as part of buying that. We strongly encourage that. But I say we don't have, I wouldn't say we have a big problem with non-compliant boat owners.
I mean, how onerous would it become, say, for instance, if it was part of Jersey's legislation that if you purchased a boat, you had to partake in a course, for instance, before you could then pilot the boat?
I think it's different. So I think there's different people, so you've got to imagine people don't currently have one. So is this something you're going to bring in going forward? The blue economy is really important to Jersey in terms of, our mariners, our marine traders. It's something we should be really proud of because it's all domestically driven. I think it might put some people off buying a boat. How would it work with UK sailors coming down? So the Channel Islands is very much seen as a badge of honour if you're a sailor from the UK because of the tides and the reefs. We'd be ruling out, we'd have to say, we couldn't have to, so we'd have to say to UK sailors, you can no longer come. I think it's complicated. I think if we're having lots of issue with incompetency, and as a Harbourmaster, I was worried about particularly safety, but also our supply chain being interrupted through that.
Yeah.
I think it would be a valid conversation.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's where we are.
How often are incidents occurring where you or your officers have maybe come across persons who've maybe been piloting a boat, but they've been inexperienced, and they've maybe found themselves in a bit of trouble, and they've obviously then had to be rescued by the services?
So to give you a broad idea, and I didn't bring any Coast Guard stats with me, we respond to about 200 incidents a year within Coast Guard, and it's very seasonal, so it tends to be in the winter, not so much, but quite serious in the summer. Certainly within that 200 in the summer, there's quite a bit of people running out of fuel, or potentially ending up on sandbanks, and then requiring assistance. I can definitely provide those stats for you. And we publish them. We have a Coast Guard annual report where that's published on the website. Okay. It's probably around, I'd imagine, 50% in the summer, maybe perhaps a little bit more in terms of responses.
And is there anything for you, Minister, that you'd maybe like to see be addressed in future regarding some of the issues that we've spoken about so far?
You mentioned licensing. I think I agree with Captain. For me, when you bring in any regulations, it's got to be very proportionate to the actual activity that's occurring. Yeah. And we're not seeing lots of activity, which tells us there's a problem with incompetency on the seas. I do think you need to see that before you start bringing in rules.
But you are bringing in legislation, aren't you?
But that's because we saw that there were some gaps, and so in this case, obviously, the inability to compel a breath test. At the end of the day, most people would volunteer a breath test because they know they haven't been drinking. The ones who don't volunteer are probably the ones you wanted to be able to compel. And tightening up on that.
Doesn't tell you whether they've committed the offence of dangerous or careless operation of a ship, does it?
No, but you asked me, you said you bring in these rules,
yeah.
And it was in the context of Deputy Andrew's question, which was kind of, what has made you think about bringing these rules? And so one of them was the inability to compel a breath test. Another one was about the difficulty in reaching prosecutions on reckless.
Look, if we can just
focus side of things, so creating better definitions around that was really important.
To focus on the breath test is to establish whether they've been drinking, but it's not an offence to pilot a boat having been drinking.
No, it's an offence to be careless in operation of a boat, and it's very difficult if you're.
But what I'm saying is that proves
inebriated. It's difficult not to be careless.
It's an aggravated offence, isn't it? So you can be careless without being inebriated.
That's correct.
You can be dangerous without being inebriated. You can presumably also be inebriated without being dangerous or careless.
That's correct.
Yeah.
But in that case, there isn't a prosecution that will follow necessarily. You have to have the carelessness.
Yeah, you need the carelessness, of course. So, but what I'm saying is you can be careless without having drunk anything.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay. But could I ask maybe a related question? So perhaps to the minister or to anyone who cares to answer. Really, what in your experience, it could be for the Harbourmaster. What do you think the main reasons are for carelessness or dangerous operation of a vessel in your experience?
So in the context of these regulations where we would want to take a prosecution?
I just mean, so outside of this, in your experience, when there have been instances of people being careless or dangerous in practice, what does that result from? Is it a lack of training? Is it personalities? Is it?
What I would call it is what we call in the office then is deliberate incompetence. So the person driving out the paddleboard, for example, anger, frustration, they knew exactly what they were doing, showing off in their boat. I think there's been an example I think you gave an example earlier about a prosecution of someone in the harbour who had been drinking. They had a family on board. Where we, I suppose, draw a line, or where we begin to look at things very seriously, where other people are being endangered, where other people are being put at risk, and that's what's unacceptable. I think, again, I know it's slightly nuanced. I use the example of the speeding within small roads and the red lights of the harbour. Of course, running a red light on the avenue, you've got oncoming traffic, and potentially if you run the red light in harbour, now you could be operating the vessel carelessly under these regulations, and if you've been drinking, that could be a reason why you've done it. It could be that you're from France and you don't fully understand the local regulations around the Ida lights, but it's the point where there's a potential to harm, which...
No, I get that. So my question, I suppose, to the Minister then, is that this legislation, because it's light touch, if you like, is it's reactive, not proactive. So if one of the reasons that somebody is driving a jet ski at a paddleboarder is because they're the type of person, or they're in a mindset where they're minded to be dangerous, that would suggest to me that there's somebody who's not the type of it's not a fit person to be driving a jet ski, piloting a jet ski. But of course, there's no check or balance about whether anyone's a fit person to be in charge of a vessel. Now, when it comes to the road traffic, I mean, there's a whole load of checks. First of all, you need to...
Not anger. Anger's not something you check.
No, but you
when
can
get
check
a
whether
driving
somebody's a fit person. I mean, same with let's say if it's a gun licence, so there'll be a check. Guns are dangerous. Boats, cars are potentially lethal weapons, aren't they? Would you agree?
Absolutely. I don't quite see what you're saying, because when I took my driving test, I took a driving test, and it had nothing to do with my mood, my type of personality I was. But nothing like that was in that test, and I've not been retested since then.
But what I think it does...
Yes, I could have an angry moment on the road.
But you've got to prove to yourself, you've got to prove to your instructor and to your examiner during that whole course that you can do an exam, and if you're presented with issues on the road. So there's a process that's been gone through.
But they're just about the rules of the road.
But they're also about your demeanour. So presumably if you were to get very angry when you were driving and ended up driving carelessly as a result, you wouldn't pass your test.
But that's only in that one instance. And the instructor won't come into that.
It may be one Craig can maybe answer, and maybe, I think there are plenty of examples, aren't there, of, I read the local newspapers of people who have driving licences who then take their cars and speed. I mean, there's been a campaign in the parishes about people speeding and essentially using the country roads as racetracks. All those people have licences. I'm not, again, I think things have got to be proportionate. If I was going to the Minister and when I'm doing my Harbour Authority report and say, gosh, this is like the 5th time in this year we've had somebody operating a jet ski recklessly where they put another user in danger. We've had another swimmer which has just had a near miss with a boat. I think we would be looking at, well, first of all, we'll be looking at our risk control measures. So do we need to put more speed limits in place? Do we need to be doing more education? Do we need to be doing more patrols in the bay? But at that point, we'd also then be looking to change the regulations. But that's not the picture that we've currently got. And I think for me, as an enforcement authority, we've got to be proportionate and be able to do it by consent. And do we write regulations? Do we write regulations for something which isn't happening? Kind of, I don't know, like a worst case scenario. Do we write regulations which are fit for the level of risk that we've currently got?
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, one of the things I think the difficulty with kind of modern life, to take it away from these just regulations, is we're constantly trying to stop all possibilities happening, to remove 100% of risk from everything. As a result, we now have regulations across all sorts of areas which are all just designed to try to do the impossible, which is remove risk. You cannot remove all risk. It's utterly impossible to do that. And so I think when you are writing regulations, it is absolutely fundamentally important that the government and the States Assembly look at regulations to say, are they proportionate to where we are today? And you don't know what the future will bring, but are they proportionate to the type of activity and the type of behaviour we're seeing today? Because if they're not proportionate, then I do believe you will get, if they're onerous, you will then get that sense amongst the community being regulated that this is without their consent, that this is too much, and that this is not something that they believe should be how their lives are run by some government somewhere else. So I think it's really important that proportion is
Minister,
there.
first, do you agree with that ethos? Do you think it's right that we shouldn't over-regulate, we shouldn't ask for boat owners to have licences or basic training?
I think that's an interesting question asking of me. I think the thing is that...
I mean, you are Justice and Home Affairs, you see.
Correct, I am, but I have no authority over the space of the waters.
Is it right that we treat, say, boat owners differently to car owners?
Well, I think the thing is that I can't make comment on how people behave on the water. If you look back, the law for the road traffic jersey law was brought in 1956 What was there before that? I don't know. And the assumption is that as time has moved on and we've got more vehicles on the road, we've probably had to implement more rules in order to able to address those matters. In relation to, I suppose the challenge is, isn't it, if you have little or no concern about how people behave on the water, then would you necessarily bring in legislation when you haven't got concerns? I think is the point here, isn't it? I think, for me, if it was apparent that the behaviour was getting to a position where you thought, actually, this is no longer acceptable, I don't know how many boats we have that sort of go to St Bullard's Bay every week. I don't know how many jet skiers there are in St Albans, etc., etc. But I would anticipate, as somebody that is always concerned about people's welfare and well-being in relation to that, I think it has to be decided about if it gets to the stage where your waters are like your roads, you may then have to consider how you're going to police that. And that's not us policing it, that is the harbour authorities policing it, because obviously that is their domain, not ours. We have no authority on the harbour. You're asking me about would I legislate? In an ideal perfect world, if you're driving a boat, you'd have a course and a licence. In an ideal world, if you're on a set of skis, on the mountains, you have a helmet and all of that goes with it. I think it has to be proportionate, and so for me, I don't disagree with what Kirsten says in relation to it has to be proportionate. But if it got to the stage where every week you were having incidents, then I would be probably saying within the State Assembly, this now needs to be considered and looked at. France clearly has rules and regulations. I don't know what they are because this really isn't our domain.
So I think I get your message there. So I'll cut in, not to be rude, but just I think I've understood. Can I ask you then about the Road Traffic Law 1956? Because I think that is a starting point for this legislation. So, and feel free to jump in, Officer Jackson as well. So Article 28 of the Road Traffic Law talks about being drunk, driving under the influence of alcohol. So
it's changed from when I was in there.
It's an offence and it's
Article 16.
Is that the right article? Or?
It is, yeah, amended.
It's been amended.
Yeah. What's the number between friends? But the main point is it's still in there. And there was a point in Jersey, of course, where people had different attitudes to drink driving. So I think it was tolerated. It maybe wasn't legislated for at one point.
Right. I think what you'll find is, and I'm not that old, but what happened is that it wasn't tolerated exactly, but the ability to prosecute and deal with people in relation to drink driving was a lot more onerous. As an example, if there was a feeling that you may have been drinking, you used to have to walk along a white line in the middle of the road, and also if you were stopped by the police. And also it was about a medical examination and bloods being taken, etc., etc. Obviously, the escalation of serious injuries and the amount of time that was spent in the accident and emergency department by the police prior to the breathalyzer being brought in. I mean, the breathalyzer was in the UK a lot longer before it came to Jersey, and it was implemented in March, I think it was March 1990, when it actually came in to fruition, which actually then makes it a lot easier and identifiable. So if you stop somebody, if they're involved in an accident, policy will now tell you that those individuals involved in that accident will be breathalyzed. It's not in the law, but it's a policy.
What do you think about the social attitudes to drink driving? Have they changed over time?
Oh, I think it absolutely has. But it's also it's also changed the whole dynamic of how Jersey looks, because you no longer have coastal nightclubs and pubs and everything else. So it has totally changed the dynamics of Jersey.
And do you think there's social pressure now for people not to drink and drive as well? So it's not just the fact that it's enforced legally.
Yeah, I fully appreciate that that's the case, but it was, as I said, because of the fact that there was significant serious injuries and fatalities in relation to alcohol-related crashes
So when
at
it come-
night time in particular.
So when it comes to the, I know this is not your law, but when it comes to the issue of drinking and then getting behind the wheel of a boat or a sailboat or a motorboat, has that come to the Council of Ministers for a philosophical discussion about whether or not what the law should be on that?
No.
So I'll put it to the Home Affairs Minister first, but do you think it's morally okay for somebody to drink, say, 3 pints of lager or a bottle of wine and then to get behind a motorboat and take it out?
Morally, my own view would be no, it isn't. Because from my perspective, if you are in charge of, if you think about, if you're in charge of it, from my perspective, and I'm probably not the best person to ask really, but from my perspective, if you're in charge of something, whether that's a bike, a horse, a car, a boat, a jet ski, anything that you are in charge of that can cause an injury to somebody else, my moral stance would be you shouldn't be drinking alcohol, okay? The thing in relation to the driving of a boat, of course, you would only know that if something happened, but you'd only know that if something happened in relation to all of the other things as well. So I might say, morally, I say drink driving is not acceptable. However, people still do it. The only time that it's dealt with is if they're involved in a crash, they're stopped by the police for some other reason, or somebody reports it to the police and the police then follow that story up. But what I would expect, and I would assume that in relation to this legislation, if somebody came into the harbour and got off a boat and literally collapsed on the pontoon, I would expect the Harbour Authority to actually go and see, and if that person was totally intoxicated, I would anticipate that they would deal with that person. Does that answer your question?
Well, it answers the question about whether you think it's morally right, and you said no, you don't think it is. I think the question I've got, I suppose, the Minister, is it? Do you think it's morally acceptable for somebody to have a bottle of wine, a full-strength wine, or 3 pints of alcohol, of beer, and then get behind the wheel of a boat?
I think anyone who's, as Deputy Hegarat said, anyone who's operating machinery of some sort, and by that I mean all the way
Anything.
down to a paddleboard, to a
Anything.
bicycle, to a tractor, to a car,
Yeah.
to a boat. You are best not doing that whilst drunk. It's just that simple.
So you say you're best not doing it, but
we don't have. I don't know when the last prosecution was on people drunk on bikes. But they're using the road. It's probably an offence to be drunk on a bike. I look across here, but I bet you there hasn't been a prosecution for a very long time on that.
But a
And there's
bike's
no
not to be.
licence needed for that
We're not
either.
talking about bikes.
And they're on a very closed piece of road.
We're
as
not
opposed to a
talking about
wider-
bikes. We're talking about cars. So if you get behind,
But I think it's important to look at the road, given that you want to compare to road traffic. Road traffic is not just cars. There are users of roads who are unlicensed, but legally unlicensed, like bike users, and who, my guess, in fact, I know I've seen some people who look very inebriated while cycling, but my guess is there have been incredibly few prosecutions of
I think we're not talking about bikes, though, are we? I prefer to be hit by a cyclist than a drunk driver, but that's just me. But we're not here to talk about bikes. But the point is, so you've said you don't think people should get behind the wheel of a boat and steer it if they're best not doing it. But when it comes to a car, they can't do it legally, can they? So we tell people, we don't want you to do it, you shouldn't do it, and it's not lawful to do it. But that's not the message we're sending out with boats, is it?
I think, again, comes back to the proportionate.
Could you answer the question? So we're not sending that message out for boat operators, are we?
I think we are sending that message out, because what we are saying is that we are tightening the law from where it is today to say that if you are caught in charge of a boat that's being driven carelessly and that you have been drinking, then you will be in trouble. You will be prosecuted. And today, that is not an offence that we can prosecute. And so now we have an offence that you can prosecute.
You can prosecute for carelessness. So
You can prosecute for carelessness.
and that's a sufficient condition, isn't it? So it's when it comes to prosecuting for careless operation of a ship, it's a sufficient condition that they should just be doing it carelessly. They don't need to. The alcohol element doesn't.
That's correct.
Doesn't
come
affect
into it
that, does
necessarily.
it? No.
I think what I would say is, though, it's quite an aggravating factor, isn't it? So going back to, firstly, again, around education. So be really clear, Jersey Coast Guard does not endorse people going and drinking and going out on boats.
But you're presumably neutral on it, aren't you?
Neutral in what sense?
Well, from a legal point of view, you're neutral on whether people drink on boats or not and then operate them. All you care about is whether they're doing it safely and not dangerously.
We want people to be able to operate vessels properly. So there are offences of careless and dangerous. But the aggravating offence of being, if you're doing something carelessly and you've been drinking, it's up to a 2-year prison sentence. That's a very clear message.
But it's for careless operation of a vessel, isn't it? It's not. So, for example, somebody who's an experienced drunken sailor, if you excuse the slightly funny sounding phrase, it's better to be an experienced drunken sailor who's not going to drive carelessly, sail carelessly, than to be an inexperienced sober sailor who is going to be careless.
I think we're going to really...
No, but I mean, that's what we're talking about. The law says whether you're drunk or not, it's neither here nor there. It's an aggravating offence, but the main thing is you mustn't steer a vessel. You mustn't be careless. If you happen to be drunk, that's aggravating, but you can be drunk.
The penalties are much
You can be as drunk
different.
as you like, so long as you're not dangerous.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be very difficult to be drunk
And
not be dangerous. I think
There's reality in this as well.
I think there's some
reality.
I think again, just looking at the States of Jersey Police, that there needs to be calls for them to breathalyse. They can't just knock on my door and say, "Bill, I fancy breathalysing you today."
Yeah, but they can do it if they suspect you've been drinking. So in a car,
They can only do it if they suspect you've been drinking,
but
as is the
you
case
can't
here.
do that to people on a boat if you think they've been
So you've got
drinking.
to have reason to be suspicious.
You've got to suspect they've committed a separate offence.
And I think given the level of offending we have, the level of accidents we have. I mean, remember, the drink driving regulation was brought in because there were lots of accidents. There were lots of people dying on the roads. There was, irresponsible behaviour. These regulations, I guess, are written around the level of risk which is presented. And again, I know I keep going back to around policing, around consent. We have a good relationship with our boat owners. We have a good relationship. The Coast Guard has a good reputation, I believe, in Jersey. Our engagement with the boat owning community. That's something that we should be very careful about. The Harbour Authority, we are centeneers. We have the same powers as centeneer. We have policing role, but we also have a responsibility for maritime safety. That's a fine balance to walk, and I think having the right set of regulations which proportionate are. I think boat owners would be quite uncomfortable with the idea that I think there needs to be a threshold at which the Harbourmaster can start to, exert his powers or at a level.
I think it's also worth saying that, looking at the two laws, and obviously I've asked officials, etc., and some of the advice I've received has said that, in general terms, it's only a matter of drafting style that differentiates the provisions from the 1956 road traffic law and the proposed new offences inserted into these regulations, which have been modelled on road traffic offences. And so, there is a great similarity. And I think when it comes to the suspicion of someone operating a vehicle whilst under the influence of alcohol, to my knowledge, please do step in if I'm wrong here, but you can only be stopped and breath tested in Jersey on the roads if the police officer has suspicion that you are, and to be that you are under the influence, I believe. Is that correct?
No, not technically, because you can be stopped if you're involved in an accident. Then it's policy
But that's the same.
yeah. And then if you commit a moving road traffic offence, so
Yeah.
and then if you're stopped, so as a prime example, during Christmas time, New Year time, there will be specific road checks, and between both the Honorary Police and the States of Jersey Police. During those times, if you're having people driving in a queue and you speak to somebody and you suspect that they've been drinking, then you can breathalyse them.
But there has to be a suspicion, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, you have to suspect that you can smell alcohol.
It's not possible just to say, I don't like the look of you, I'm giving
No.
you a breath test. There
I'll
has
give you a
to be
scenario. So
And here the carelessness.
A police
is
officer sees-
tantamount to the suspicion.
police officer sees somebody come out of a pub, get into a car, so they know they've been at a pub for an hour or two, get into a car, it might be reasonable for the officer to then test that person, so I suspect you've been drinking.
No.
Or if they see that they've been drinking.
Yes.
Yeah.
But then you form your reasonable ground to suspect that they have been drinking.
So if you see somebody been drinking in the Royal Square at the corn riots, had a couple of pints, get in their car, you could stop them and reasonably ask for a breath test.
Yes.
The equivalent happens in a boat. You see somebody having a bottle of wine and then start to go off in a boat. Can you stop them and breathalyse them?
No, because that won't be an offence. They have to be
That's correct.
piloting that boat in a careless manner.
So getting back, sorry to labour.
I then put that into the context of the seas are not enclosed roads, they are wide open seas. If there is any dangerous or careless behaviour on that boat or driving that boat, then they absolutely can be stopped. And so I'd say the question is, are you trying to criminalise people who aren't in any danger? Because if someone is piloting a boat, regardless of whether they've been drinking or not, if someone is piloting a boat carefully, they are being aware of the people around them and they are operating that boat safely. Why are you trying to criminalise them?
I'm not saying we are. So I'm talking about messages.
Why would you want to?
I'm talking about the messages that we send out. So, for example, I've seen the police have had a road campaign which says "None for the road." Is that right?
I think
don't know if it's
roads
still
are
live.
entirely different.
No, just so there's a campaign that says "None for the road." Okay, is that's an interesting campaign because, of course, that's not the legal position. You are allowed to have a small amount and drive, but I think the message you're sending out as a government is it's better not to drink and drive. Now, it'll be very difficult for you to send that message out.
I can send that message out.
You couldn't have
It's better not to drink.
You
and
couldn't
sail.
have a campaign saying none for the boat, could you?
Can do.
But
Could do.
because people would say, but that's not the law.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You don't have to have a law to say that something is worth doing or not
So
doing.
what's the message that you'll
So
be
I would
sending
say
out?
it is worth studying your homework if you're a school child, but there's no law to do that. I can still say to them it's worth studying your homework to get your exams. You don't need a law in order to be able to tell someone that it's worth acting in a particular way.
So what is the message you'll be sending out to boat owners with regard to alcohol, Minister?
The message I'm sending is that they need to be very much more aware of the fact that if they are drinking, that they should definitely think twice before.
What's
getting
your
in that
slogan?
boat,
So
because
that
they
they've
can now
got-
be stopped. I'm not here to do slogans.
No, but the
If
police-
you want to
the
do
police have
politics
got-
by sloganeering, that's up to you.
I'm here to ask questions. So there's a very catchy slogan that the police have, which
But
is
I'm
none
not
for the
here to
road.
be an advertising person, and I'm sure the police may have spent money on trying to get an advertising person to come with a catchy slogan. I can invest in a catchy slogan if you wish.
Well,
but
what's
I'm
the
not gonna do
message?
it
So what's
here.
the message to boat owners who are legally allowed to drink? Is that do you want to change the drinking culture that's associated with some maritime activity, or do you want to leave it?
No, I want to make sure that the seas are a safe enough place for everyone to enjoy them. That's what I want to do, and that's what we're doing. I think
What if enjoying them
the
involves having
statistics I have here say 215 total incidents over the last 5 years. I imagine there's been more than 215 total road incidents in Jersey in the past year. I'd imagine. I imagine it's more than 200. And so we are talking about something which is barely 40 or 50 incidents a year. It's barely one a week, and most of them are just going through the harbour traffic lights. So there's not this immense problem to solve, and that's where the proportion comes in. I don't believe that without having a big problem to solve, I don't think you should be trying to solve a problem that's not there.
Okay. Can I just ask, Minister, how satisfied are you with P3? And can you also confirm whether you do have concerns and what are those concerns?
I would prefer to have something that says no alcohol, because I just think that it's quite clear. And I think the Minister sitting next to me is probably of the same view, that actually it's not about preventing somebody having a glass of wine on a boat. It is about actually saying that you shouldn't be intoxicated whilst sailing a boat.
And can I ask as
We
well?
can do an education campaign which says that with these laws in place. Without these laws in place, if we keep the laws exactly as they are today, there would be still huge amounts of value in doing a campaign about not being intoxicated while driving a boat. And the laws we have in place today are weaker than the laws that I'm presenting to the Assembly. So, but the weaker laws wouldn't negate this.
Wouldn't it be better to have a campaign saying don't be reckless or careless or dangerous when you're piloting a boat, because that's what the law says.
But I
And
can do
one
that.
of those factors might be don't drink, because that increases your
I
likelihood.
can do that. I can do that campaign today with the existing laws, there's no hypocrisy in saying you better not being drunk whilst driving a boat and having a big campaign saying if you're going on the water today, don't drink. It's better for you. It's safer for you.
We got one
There's
minister,
no hypocrisy in that.
We've got one minister here saying that, and I understand that she's saying she'd prefer it if the law was clear, so you shouldn't be able to drive on a boat, full stop. Is that your position?
I think it's not entirely my position. I think people are best if they don't drink, but I think there is that idea that people do have a boat, they go off to boat or whatever it is, and they sit down for a picnic, and they may well have a drink, and they then get back on their boat. And I don't think we should be criminalising it because there isn't a problem. That's the issue. There isn't this big problem where we need to start
Are
criminalising.
you committing to an ad campaign to tell people not to drink?
I don't have the budget to commit to that campaign.
It just seems like a bit of a nanny thing to do, to tell people not to
I
have
think
a drink on a boat.
nannying is trying to criminalise people for things when there's no big issue in that respect. at all.
Sorry, can I ask, Minister, as well, were you consulted on P3 before its lodging?
No.
Right. And can I also ask as well of yourself, Craig, whether you were consulted about P3 before its lodging?
No.
And is there anything that you would like to have maybe implemented as part of P3? And if so, what would that have been?
I would prefer there to be something to say that people shouldn't be, I suppose the word is over a prescribed limit. Because if you look at driving a car, you actually are, it's quite clear. And the advice always is none for the road, because it is not simple and straightforward to say that somebody can drink 1 glass, 2 glasses or 3 glasses of wine. It depends on weight, the individual, whether they've had anything to eat, and there's all sorts of dynamics. So I would prefer to have legislation that does prevent that, because that doesn't stop somebody from having a picnic, but it does actually have the fact that if they do that, that is part of what because I can't, morally, I can't be a police officer for 25 years and then suddenly flip my brain and have a different view about drinking and operating of any machinery.
No, thank you very much.
I think
Minister.
importantly, these regulations do bring prescribed limits.
I'd just like to ask you, Craig, had you been consulted, what would your advice have been to the officers in bringing forward P3 before yourself?
I think very similar to the Minister's stance. It obviously tightens the regulations, but also I do err on the side of the subject matter experts, and the Harbourmaster, he's the expert of the waters, knows the data, knows the statistics.
Yeah.
We've got the statistics for the road. We've seen the impact and the cause and effect that drink driving has on our communities. Yet I look at the Harbourmaster, look at his data to actually say, and I get the Minister as well, the proportionality side to bring something into it. Is it a problem, and is it proportionate to tackle something that's not there? So road traffic jersey law, I came as a police and it's already been adopted. I've got to look at the experts with regards to implementing P3 and bringing what's actually a problem and trying to problem solve the issues of the harbours.
I think it's, sorry if I may, I think it's important your question on consultation. So obviously this has been all presented to Council of Ministers. And so the Minister has had opportunity to look at these laws, and
Might not been present.
they have been presented to Council of Ministers. On top of that, we've had a public consultation for a long time. And obviously police force and Minister were entirely able to take part in that public consultation as well. That was a publicised public consultation. And so from that perspective, there has been consultation. And the consultation was actually well adopted. There was quite a strong response.
75% approval rate from the consultation.
Yeah.
Sorry, what was that?
75% approval rating. How many responses did we get?
14.
14. There you go. So it wasn't strong and getting confused with a different one.
Questions like mandatory training, licensing of
It's not something we were consulting on. It wasn't
It
part
wasn't
of our
consulting.
thinking at the time.
No, right.
And I don't apologise for that. I think, we are strengthening a law. And so the law today, we are strengthening from the position it's in. And I think that's the right thing. I think it is very important that you take a community with you. And I think the community in this case, because I also think it's important to have evidence-based decision-making and evidence-based legislating. I think it's too easy to say, oh, we shouldn't. That's basically crying from some moralistic perspective. And it's interesting.
We shouldn't what, sorry?
It's you've been it's when you say shouldn't, it's coming from this moralistic perspective, which we shouldn't do X or you shouldn't do Y. I'm just saying, I'm talking in general terms, not specifically about these laws. It is very easy for legislators to say you shouldn't, or people to say that, to moralise. And it's interesting that your questions, Chair, have been about morality, not about reality. And I think here, the reality of the situation here is that we don't have an excessive problem with either incidents on the sea, we don't have an excessive problem with drunken incidents on the sea, and what we are trying to do is take that into account, but say that we have seen literally one incident in 2017, and another incident more recently where somebody did refuse a breath test, or refused to volunteer a breath test, where we thought, actually, no, we need to tighten this up. And it's by looking at those incidents, which is the reality and the evidence before us, that I have then said, right, let's tighten these up, but take them to the next step. If there is some point in the future where we are seeing many hundreds of incidents and particularly where, danger is very much happening at sea, where people are driving their vessels in all sorts of dangerous ways, then of course you should look at it. But we just don't have any of the evidence. So why would you want to take freedom from people? Because that's what this is about, freedom from people. When there's no evidence.
Freedom to drink.
Why is it wrong to drink? Is it morally wrong to drink? Is it?
I think it's morally. You said it's morally wrong to get behind the wheel of a vessel if you're drunk.
I didn't say that.
So you don't think it? Do you think it is morally right or wrong?
I don't know whether it's morally wrong.
Your fellow ministers given a clear.
I think it's better not to.
I think earlier you said it's better not to do it. Yeah. Why? Why is it better not to?
I think it's better not to. I think that you can be more sure of yourself and the people around you if you are not. But
are you not moralising?
Evidence doesn't.
It sounds like you're saying you should. You're telling people what they should and shouldn't do.
No, I didn't. That's the opposite. You're the one who's telling people.
I'm asking questions, Minister.
No, you're making some statements as well.
I'm asking some questions. If they come across as statements, they're because they're rhetorical questions. So I think are we happy to move on this? I think we've got to
just for clarity. You asked the question about whether I was consulted, and the answer to that I said was no. And what I meant was that we were not consulted before the law was presented. I have no issue with the law in relation to strengthening the powers of Harbourmasters, because I agree that it needs to be strengthened because of the fact that it's difficult to prosecute. Yeah. I may have very different views to what the Minister or the Harbourmaster thinks about what I would put in a legislation, because I've got a wide brain in a certain way.
I think as well, ministerial code does say you should consult with ministers when it affects their areas. This, to my knowledge, doesn't particularly affect the Home Affairs Minister's area, which is why perhaps I didn't knock on your door more directly.
But do you accept that it's absolutely right? Part of our job is to do legislative scrutiny.
Of course.
And part of that process is to understand the philosophy behind legislating, so why legislation is brought forward, and what the philosophy behind the legislation is. Do you accept that's reasonable?
I think, that sounds reasonable.
Okay, good.
In terms of that, I also think, so part of my thinking as a legislator, maybe incorrect thinking, but part of my thinking as a legislator is you shouldn't legislate unless there's a need to. And I strongly, that's part of my political thinking in general. You should not legislate unless there is a need to legislate.
But do you accept the fact that you've introduced into this new legislation, the proposed legislation, a prescribed limit for alcohol? You accept that you've done that, and that doesn't exist up until now. That's not existed in this legislation up until now. So what you are saying is that there's a dangerous level over which you shouldn't have so much alcohol in your system otherwise, because what's the purpose of that limit?
What that purpose of that limit is to prescribe an evidential limit so that prosecutions can be made.
Okay.
In itself, those limits don't necessarily, they don't cast a moral aspersion anyway.
What does that consumption of alcohol prove? What is it you're trying to prove by showing that people who are otherwise just reasonably enjoying themselves, what does it prove that the fact they've got alcohol in their system?
In this case, it's proving that that the alcohol was likely contributing to their dangerous or careless piloting of the vessel.
How does it do that?
In what way?
How does it prove that it contributed to their dangerous driving? or dangerous?
Well, that's the whole purpose of the offence.
But how does it prove that? Because it's an offence in its own right. So careless operation of a vessel is an offence in its own right. How does the consumption of alcohol, how does that prove that it's
It's
contributing to
incorrect to
that?
say it proves it.
So,
It was your word rather than mine, but it was, you know, I'm just trying to say that we put a prescribed limit in there
So-
for evidential reasons. So we now have
but what
something
what
to
does it evidence? What does it prove?
I don't know.
I think going back to the
I mean, it's your legislation, Minister, so it must
No,
say
I'm not sure it proves anything.
So why is it there then?
As I said, it's there because we now have an evidential limit which shows that we can prosecute.
But what does it show though? What does it show about the careless or dangerous operation of a vessel?
I don't know, you tell me.
It's not my
I
legislation.
don't know. But
You don't know.
I'm saying I think it shows that you've had an amount of alcohol which has contributed
It's
to
in the road
careless
traffic
driving.
law. What it shows is that you've committed an offence by having that in your system, which is that you shouldn't have been driving.
But it doesn't show that in this case.
No.
No, it doesn't.
So should it be there at all?
I think it does because I think we can now say that your careless driving was made worse or your careless piloting was made worse likely by the use of alcohol.
it helps if I can come in. So being a Harbourmaster, I'm a practical person. So we got laws and regulations that we need to enforce to keep people safe. So ideally, people will obey rules, but it gets to a point where you need to have rules and consequences to the rules that are real. You know, that there is. So again, I think if you are operating a vessel carelessly and you have had a drink, that's an aggravating factor. Again, coming back to when we take a prosecution, it's that we're not looking out for the incompetent or the incompetent, but the person who has, you know, because don't forget a boat is everything from a paddleboard to a 60-foot sunseeker. Somebody who is deliberately going out the way knowingly to put someone else at risk, and having had a drink is an aggravating factor. And just go back to is it okay to drink? No, and we've done Coast Guard. It's not. I don't think it's contradictory either. We've done Coast Guard comparison. We are responsible for sea safety. And that's one part of Portsmouth Jersey responsibility as the harbour authorities to keep people safe at sea and to educate them around that. And we've done educations around alcohol consumption, both on the beach, on boats, coastal activities.
Is this then? Well, two questions, and we will move on. But I think it's quite, you know, it's potentially an area for amendment from the panel. So I think we
Believe
do.
me, I kind of knew that before I came in.
And given the fact that one of the ministers already supports it, it's not a bad start.
Yeah,
The
supporting and voting are two different things.
There's two questions. The first one is if we accept that it's not ideal to drink alcohol and then get behind the vessel, behind the wheel of a boat, and we accept that it's not a fair comparison to compare it to the roads for all sorts of reasons, is it reasonable to ask then why the limit's being set the same as for the road? So
Yeah,
it could have been a different limit.
We could have put a different limit, but to provide a different limit, I think we'd have had to find a way of evidencing a different limit. So quite simply, in this case, we have adopted the road traffic levels because it is much simpler to do so.
Does that in itself pose a problem? Because you're saying on the one hand it's not the same. It could well be that you could say that, you know, the sea's much bigger. We come from a different culture where it's not been outlawed to drink and
You
sail.
can make that argument.
So would it have been better to actually have higher limits for?
You could have made that argument, but I think we'd have had to then find our own method of testing to find a particular limit somewhere. And I don't think Jersey's in a position to do that.
I think trying to get consistency is important. So I think the really important part of these regulations was providing clarity. So if I'm an experienced mariner, but if I'm a less experienced mariner and I pick up these regulations, can I read them and understand them? I think you can. I think having different levels would be confusing. I think it's really tricky because there are comparisons to cars and there are comparisons to cars. And I don't know if this is a good example or a bad example, but I'll give it to you. So these regulations also, to a certain extent, regulate water skiing. So it's okay to have a boat, have somebody water ski behind you, have somebody to be able to spot that going on. It's not okay for me to put a rope behind my car and pull somebody on roller skates. The two are similar, but they're different. And I think what we've tried to do here is provide regulations which can be read and understood by the lay person, because boating is a leisure activity. Regulations which can apply to both leisure mariners and professional mariners. And as much as possible, we shouldn't be confusing people. So to try and draw parallels where reasonably practicable to existing legislation.
I think it is also really important, and sometimes it's easy to forget in these, we have widened the definition of ship in the previous legislation that went through in P4. And so now we are also talking about people on paddle boards, in kayaks. And so what you're also suggesting is that you should have a prescribed limit for people getting in a kayak. I'm not convinced that that's an appropriate way forward in terms of saying you should not be in control of a kayak after having drunk. I think you're going to the limit of you are literally taking away people's freedom in those situations for no good reason, and that's not an area I want to go into.
But it would be within your gift, wouldn't it, to differentiate?
Yeah.
So in the same
but it's within all sorts of people in authority have all sorts of powers in their gift. They don't necessarily deploy them for good reason.
I think it helps again. I think what we've seen, so these regulations came in 2012, just before me actually, but they preceded a set of quite old regulations, I think which are called the surf riding or something along those regulations. Maritime activity evolves quite a lot. So what we've seen is jet skis, paddle boards are quite common, common scene now. People are now all of a sudden starting to have fording boards, for example. It's quite easy to try and write specific regulations. I think, again, these are hopefully simple for lay people to understand and encompass a broad range of maritime activity.
So so that's really useful. There's some just to move things on and maybe lighten the tone a little bit. Regulation 2 talks about some interpretation. So 2B talks about using a ship to ride the surf. And I presume in that case it's because we're talking about not a ship, but maybe like a surfboard or a kayak. Is that right?
The definitions that went through in P4.
Yeah.
Correct. It's a surfboard. So anything, I can't remember, it's 1.2 metres and with a fin is regarded as ship. And that was to capture the requirement for third-party insurance, which I kind of remind people you are supposed to have, if you have a surfboard.
So with the surfboard, it's still a requirement that you need to get insured. I think it's been a long-standing thing.
Yes, and that came from the original. It's quite unique, I think, to the Jersey.
You normally register with a club. Is it a club or something? Or?
Yeah, and if you register with a club, quite often that club then has insurance which covers you.
But it's just that there are some interesting turns of phrase which I don't criticise, but they're not necessarily plain English. So if I was reading that as a layperson using a ship to ride the surf, it's at best flowery language.
Yeah.
But we know it doesn't necessarily mean a ship. It means a.
But that does also point to the fact that the suggestions that you're making about having an offence, which is just not being in charge of a ship, having imbibed any alcohol, would mean that somebody who's having a beer and then wants to jump on their surfboard would be breaking the law. And what we're saying is, you can have a beer, you can jump on your surfboard, but if you then cause harm, then you can be prosecuted. But until you have caused that harm, and that's what I mean about the freedom element and the proportionality of this.
So I get that, but so that notwithstanding, when it comes to the road traffic law, there may not be a difference in law between bicycles and cars, because I think you can still be found to be drunk in charge of a bicycle. Is that right? If you're fit. But there's probably a difference in policing, isn't there? In reality, you're not going to go.
And there's also a difference in the process as well. It doesn't fall under legislation of breathalyzing. It's the unfit, which goes to, as the Minister said, the old sobriety test that comes through to it. So it is it's difference in the penalties as well with regards to unfit on a pedal cycle compared to.
So would you have to be suspecting of careless cycling, effectively?
Unfit, riding a pedal cycle whilst unfit is an offence in itself, but there again, you couldn't give the breathalyser roadside sample because it falls under a different part of legislation.
I think it's interesting because I think if you start treating people at sea for leisure purposes, because again, it's really important, none of these regulations are about commercial operators. So commercial operators operate under different regulations.
So these would apply to commercial operators.
Well, they do.
So we have the
cannot be in charge of a commercial vessel, I see.
Yeah, so the shipping law has a specific, again, similar offences.
So that's what I'm trying to say. So this is all about the leisure industry, effectively. And I think, to treat the sea, where we have 200 incidents over 5 years, most of which are crossing a traffic light, to treat the sea in the same way as treating the roads, I think is to ignore the clear differences between the two in terms of other people's safety and your impact on other people. And I think it ignores the fact, to take that approach, ignores the fact that the sea is inherently international. So you can arrive in Jersey having started in France under a different set of laws. And I think it also completely, when you try to make out that they are the same, I think what you are doing effectively is you are in danger of removing a great deal of freedom from people. And for the sake of saying you want to treat the seas the same as the roads, the seas are not the same as the roads. And therefore, they are much less densely populated. The sea is much less densely populated. It is, and so I think your approach would be seen by many as being disproportionate to the actual evidence of what is going on out there. And
So
we do not have lawless seas where lots of people are drunkenly bashing into
Most of
it.
this isn't about our approach, but what we're looking at, and we thank you because that's that's useful for the record. But we're trying to establish the differences and similarities between the two laws, and because you have used that as a starting point.
Yes,
So I
and
think
that
that's,
was to, as you say,
we
to
have-
try to make
we have no-
drafting simpler, to try to make the application simpler, to try to help the understanding.
we have no preset outcomes. It's just to try and understand. That's what we're here for.
So
So
you mentioned just before you're likely to bring an amendment.
it's
So
possible. I
understood
didn't say
that
we're
to be
likely. I said it's possible that we may. It's something we're considering.
a fairly preset outcome.
Sorry, say that again.
Nothing.
Oh, I thought you said something. Okay, let's move on because I think we've covered quite a lot of ground already, Deputy Andrews. So I think some of the questions probably up to about certainly 12 are done. Can we proceed with our questions maybe from number 21? You happy to take those?
21.
Thank you.
Okay, yes. In a letter to the panel dated on the 5th of March, you inform the panel that the penalties have been set in line with the road traffic Jersey law. Can you explain the rationale behind this and whether any other considerations were given?
I think I just have explained the rationale behind it. It was about simply. I just listed them. It was about simplicity of application, simplicity of understanding, and also making sure we could do this quickly. To set different rules would have meant trying to find different standards from somewhere else, possibly even having to create a set of testing to work out where differences should be, different levels should be. It would have massively complicated this exercise.
Did officers look at international best practice elsewhere, and if so, what other jurisdictions were explored?
So we've certainly considered it, but it's a little bit difficult to answer this question because the genesis of these amendments kind of come from some legal advice, which we're not at liberty to discuss at this time.
Okay.
However, our law officers have offered a private hearing to yourselves, which might help in your understanding a little bit of where these amendments have come from and why we've mirrored the road traffic law so much, including the penalties.
Yeah.
So if it's all right, I'll stop there, and a private hearing might be able to expand a little bit on that legal advice.
I think that's fine. We're open to that's been conveyed to us. We're open to that.
Yeah.
What I would say, this is not specific to our panel or to your department, is that we always encourage the law officers to waive their confidentiality. I think it's within their gift to do so, and I think that would make the scrutiny process a lot easier. But we know that precedent hasn't been set yet, so I'm sure between officers and yourself, we can follow up that in the appropriate way.
What if I may suggest, is that if law officers choose not to waive that confidentiality, I would still suggest you have that private briefing. I wouldn't
Yeah,
forego
thank you.
their wisdom for the
Thank
sake
you.
of.
I think just for the public record, because these are public hearings, it's an ongoing frustration for scrutiny to not be able to. We need to test evidence publicly, and that's why we have these hearings. And we can't do that when it comes to private legal advice. So that's not a new thing. Deputy Andrews, can I just ask something about? I was probably slightly remiss to refer you to question 21 because I need to ask question 19 first. So slightly more prosaically, but nonetheless important. So, Minister, Article or Regulation 9J will introduce a new offence or an offence for operating a ship in territorial waters that's emitting excessive or unreasonable noise or fumes. So, first of all, that's not entirely new, is it? I think, is there something in the pre-existing law which touches on that already?
Correct. I think it hopefully tightens the definition up. Just find the definition again now.
Yeah.
Which there we go.
Yeah. So I think in the original law it's under 9, isn't it? 9(3).
Yes, there we go. Yeah.
Well,
I don't know what the original law was.
So the original one talks about excessive or unreasonable noise or fumes. In the 2012 regulations. So that's under various offences. But anyway, let's look at what the current 9J says. So a person operates a ship emitting excessive or unreasonable noise or fumes, commits an offence and it's liable to a fine. So what's new there, I suppose, is the question, and also how is it determined what is unreasonable or excessive in those cases?
I think in this case, and it would be better to refer to a lawyer, but I think in this case it will be similar to the situation on land, which is about where it's seen as a nuisance, where it's causing a nuisance. So I think it would be very difficult to prosecute individual short moments of it. So, you know, if I'm sitting in a bay and a very loud vessel goes past me, I may complain to the Harbourmaster about that, but I don't think the Harbourmaster would be able to do much about it. The vessel's passed on, they've left the waters, whatever may happen. I think this is likely, as is the case I understand with the existing kind of nuisance laws, it's likely where that's on a repetitive basis. So it could be someone who's mooring up outside your house if you happen to live by the seaside on a regular basis and is, you know, blasting out music or leaving their engines running on a regular basis. So I think, but please do ask law officers. I think it's more likely to be about nuisance.
If it helps practically as well. So we have a relatively speaking, again, come back to this idea of, you know, policing by consent. We have a compliant boat owning community. It's very good to be able to point out to somebody, you know, you're on a two-stroke jet skis, you know, cause a lot of irritation in St. Bras Bay, and the duty officer just to walk down there and say, look, it's 6 o'clock in the morning. I appreciate you're practicing your sport stuff, but this is noisy. You do notice a regulation to be operating this vessel noisily. Perhaps you might want to consider about doing this at a more sociable time. Most people will then take those words of advice, and having a regulation which sits behind that is an important part of enforcement.
But there's presumably a measure, certainly for things like noise, it's easier to measure objectively, isn't it, than necessarily emissions, which you might depend on what cycle the engine's at, for example, or what. So when it comes to the road, so, you know, perennially there's an issue with noisy exhaust for 50 cc's, for example. They're subject to MOT equivalents, aren't they?
Now,
What's the threshold for noisy exhausts in terms of roads?
well, the process would be, if we believe it's an offence, we'd have to send it down to the driving vehicle standards, who are the subject matter experts, to give us the evidence to say it's beyond that noisy emissions. I can't tell you what the limits are on the back of that.
But there is a limit, I think, isn't there, Minister, for in terms of decibels?
Yes.
Yeah, but
There is.
as I said, it would have to be checked by DVS.
Can I ask, so there's also this interesting turn of phrase in 9J about whether it comes from the engine or otherwise. So why is that being worded like that?
Well, I think that's probably,
Again, so I think it's dealing with there are different types of noise in this. There's engine noise, but there's also activities that people do on boats,
That's
so
what I was gonna
loud
say,
music
music,
and again, there are other linking regulations in this. So we use this regulation, for example, to manage charter boats. So this is how we permit people to like safaris and totally responsible operators, by the way. But these do link as well to the permitting of charter boat operations. So I think other noise in the sense of this regulation would be antisocial noise.
Yeah. And I suppose some of this will be policed in a sense by the community. So if you're a member of a boat owners association, it may well be in the first instance you operate out of one of the St Heli harbours. Someone who's a fellow boat owner may well flag it up with you and say, look, you've got a bit of a lot of smoke coming out.
Yeah, so our operation room is manned 24 hours a day. So, you know, we will get calls of people who are, you know, say use the example of two-stroke jet skis in St Albans. That's been an example in the past where we've actually worked with the person with that jet ski who would legitimately, I think, actually was kind of like a European champion to say, look, there are better times to operate. I guess if that had continued and that was a regularly repeating offence and it was causing a nuisance, we then would, a bit like Craig would do, we would go to perhaps the Environment Department and seek some advice on what is the definition of a continuous nuisance, and then, you know, seek to build a case file around that.
Yeah, thank you. And then I'll just move on to the question of seaworthiness. So is there legislation that requires a vessel to be seaworthy?
Yes.
Yeah. Could you just point us to that and what is that within this?
So I think it's within the shipping regulations. So, I mean, one of the things we measure for seaworthiness is the ability to have insurance. So every vessel has to have third-party insurance. To be able to get insurance, the vessel needs to be seaworthy, and that's quite often how we make the link. But again, not having third-party insurance is an offence.
And is there a requirement now for the insurance to be seen when applying for a mooring, for example?
So when you apply for a mooring, so you come to Ports of Jersey, and yes, we check your insurance, and a little bit of that's self-interest because we only have third-party insurance on our mariners. You don't have to have a Ports of Jersey mooring to operate a vessel, so you can keep your vessel in your home address and slip bay launch it.
Yeah. Okay. So a bit like a car in the sense you have to have insurance. Is that right? Do you have to have insurance to have a
Correct.
vessel?
So,
Yeah.
so if your boat's sat on your drive, you don't need to have insurance for it. But if you're operating on the water in Jersey, you need to have third-party insurance.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Good. Max, are you happy to carry on with, I think, 22 or 23, whichever ones haven't been asked?
Questions just for the Minister for Home Affairs. In the submission that we received from the States of Jersey Police, the word ambiguous was used regarding our letter regarding the views of the States of Jersey Police about P3, and I just wanted to know why the word ambiguous was used about P3.
I think you'd be better asking.
If you could signpost me into the area or which letter.
So it is in terms of, I think, the enforcement aspect, in terms of the responsibilities of the Harbourmaster and the police.
Like it's a primacy, I think it is the word, and working with the Harbourmaster actually to say, as the Harbourmaster alluded to, the primacy is with Ports of Jersey to enforce these regulations, and it's the States of Jersey Police position that these regulations will increase demand on the States of Jersey Police. It's mentioned in the law, we will have the power to breathalyse, but it's our position that the primacy should be with the Ports of Jersey to actually consume that and deal with these regulations as a whole within their enforcement policy and their maritime standards team.
And Minister, are you comfortable with the responsibilities of your officers within the law, and is there any level of ambiguity that you still have? And
I think what you'll find is that both the States of Jersey Police and Craig and the Chief also are working with the Harbourmaster in relation to an MOU, which will have all of that sorted out, so it's quite clear who takes responsibility and for what.
Yeah, okay, and do you know when this MOU will be in place?
It's nearing completion as well.
Yeah,
We're working together imminently, so we're actually meeting next week to pull that together and then represent to the Chief Officer and the Harbourmaster for formalising. And it is about the primacy of which agency takes on which offences, so it's clear, it's regulated, and there's no misunderstanding at the point of the reporting.
No. And at this moment in time, what demand is there on the police for maritime issues where you and your officers are potentially called upon?
I think the natural one is, as the Harbourmaster said, Operation Nectar back in 2022, there with the tragic loss of life of 3 individuals. Over the last decade, it has been light on the demand, but I think it's a capacity versus capability that when these regulations or when the offences do happen, they can be impactful on our services of the States of Jersey Police. Like Operation Nectar, 3 gross negligent manslaughter cases, it's timing, it's and it is time consuming, and they have to be investigated. So it's not necessarily the amount, it's the capacity at that point of what the States Jersey Police are dealing with.
But of course, it's impossible to legislate or regulate or MOU for when an incident happens in relation to other incidents. It was awful that 2 severely tragic incidents happened within 2 days of each other, which obviously, you would hope would rarely happen.
Has the Leckham 2 investigation concluded?
It's going to trial September, so it's still under investigation.
Okay, thank you.
Do you mind if I?
So
that's fine.
again, this is just going to another 9, Regulation 9K in this case. So this is about the, you've already alluded to it, but towing somebody on the back of a boat, for example, as a water skier or wakeboarder, presumably, or parascending. So I presume that can cover a number of those types of activities. So when it talks about the requirement to have somebody with experience on the boat, can I just clarify, because we weren't quite clear under 9K1B, it says that the master of the boat should be accompanied. So if he or she is not accompanied with the person, that constitutes an offence by somebody with the relevant experience. So could that be the same person, or does it need to be a separate person?
Separate person.
Yeah.
So this isn't a new regulation. So I believe when it was put into the existing regulation, it was around insisting that there was somebody else there to spot. So you can imagine, you know, and I don't, when my children were slightly younger, we still enjoyed it now when they're older, I would take them out on an inflatable at the back. There needs to be somebody.
The person being towed is by definition behind them.
Well,
And
we
cannot
get the ethos of the purpose of the law. So just to clarify, we just wanted to make sure that there was a separate person. It didn't seem to be clear from the wording. But is that just simply a renumbering then, 9K, or are there any substantive changes to the wording?
I believe it's unaltered.
Yeah, I think it would probably be a case of drafting styles changing.
Yeah,
But this is probably something that you could flesh out in the private hearing, perhaps with the law officers.
that's fine. But if it's just a case of renumbering it, then there's nothing
Yeah.
material that's changed. We would just ask whether it's sufficiently clear to suggest that, but it is absolutely that there needs to be a second person with that relevant experience. One question I did have is that relevant experience or experience in the relevant activity isn't the same as being qualified.
Correct.
In that. So I could have relevant experience in sitting on the back of a boat watching someone water ski, because I've done it 10 times, but it doesn't mean I would necessarily know what to do in an emergency situation.
But I think that's, again, so you're coming out on my boat with me today. We're going to take our children out with the inflatables. I should be the master briefing you. So what I'm going to do is the kids are going out on the back of the boat. They've got their safety vests on. I want you to watch those people. You know, if the boat flips, I want you to let me know that it's flipped. Then I would just want you to pull the line in so then I can turn around and pick them up. You now you're at that point there, I would argue, you know, had with a briefing as an adult, and it could be a teenager in this instance, following that briefing that you would be, adequately briefed to undertake that tasking.
Okay, that's fine. I understand that.
That I imagine is quite different to commercial.
So between two, yes, you need to have a Reg 6 permit too.
That's what I mean. So if you're a commercial operator, you have to have a permit in order to be able to do those activities and have appropriately qualified people. But this is again, we're into the world of leisure and people's private enjoyment and their time on their own private boats.
Yeah.
So
I get that.
Asking for qualifications, I think, would be again a step too far.
So I'm not asking.
No,
that's fine.
I'm not
It's a
suggesting
thought
you are,
process. But
just saying.
what I am asking though is whether or not a layperson reading that, let alone a legislator, whether it automatically follows that kind of scenario would be covered. So it does say that you need somebody with experience in a relevant activity. And I think that seems quite subjective to me. So depending who's interpreting that law, somebody could say, well, look, you haven't got somebody who's an experienced water skier on the back of your boat, so that doesn't fulfil that.
Of course, all these things also, as much as we want these to be easily understood, and I appreciate the drafted by law officers, so we try our best as practical people to help law officers make the law sound as practical as possible. Of course, this does tie into education as well. So, as a Coast Guard, we go to the yacht clubs and the Boating Association. We do education. We go to schools and do education. Where we talk about this sort of thing, we've got a guide on our website called Enjoying Our Coastline Safety. And I think it's really important because we want people to enjoy our coastline safety. Doing, what's the right word? Activities like, I guess, coasteering and, jet skiing, and they're, thrilling. They're different, aren't they? So we wouldn't encourage people to go on the road and have a frill, for example, but we would actively encourage people to go enjoy our coastline by enjoying a jet ski or a speedboat responsibly. So we provide softer guidance to that in terms of,
Thank you. All I was getting at in that, I'm just wondering whether it just simply needed to say you need to have somebody on the boat with you. So don't go out on your own if you're doing an activity that's potentially dangerous. And that's kind of what it's saying, isn't it?
If you're towing somebody, there should be someone else on the boat who's capable of telling you someone's in trouble and then helping you, get them back on board the boat.
Yep. Okay, thank you. I know we've got quite a lot to get through. It's surprising that it's good to have just a focus for one piece of legislation, but we do have a few more questions. So one question I've got here is that the panel notes that the resource implications from this draft legislation lies with Ports of Jersey. If these regulations are adopted as is, they should come into force within 7 days. Is that correct?
I believe that's the,
Yes, that's
yeah.
correct.
Yeah. And so, do you believe that Ports of Jersey have got in place the sufficient resource to actually police and enforce these amendments?
Yeah, so we've had a slight restructuring of the team. So we do lots of different things in Ports of Jersey, from running harbours to Coast Guard. So we've recruited an ex-States of Jersey, somebody who's come from States of Jersey Police within our Maritime Standards team. So it's a Maritime Standards team which do this. They've been brought on board to just help us mostly around process and procedure. So we already have an existing duty officer roster. So we have duty officers which are on call 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. But to make sure because there is a change here in terms of, there's going to be a requirement for the duty officer to possibly breathalyse people. So we're going to need a breathalyser. Underneath that, we need process and procedure. So we have recruited someone with experience as a police officer in States of Jersey Police, and actually in a maritime context with the Ministry of Defence Police in the UK, to support the team with putting that process and procedure in place. And yeah, I think it would be good to get the MOU in place. And I think we're very close with that in terms of the final bit. But yeah, I think we're kind of in a position where we're ready for this too.
Okay. So there's going to be a new officer recruited from...
No, sorry. So we've stolen one of Craig's officers and recruited them into Ports of Jersey.
Okay.
He joined us about 6 weeks ago now, but that was in anticipation of these regulations coming forward. He's not the Ports of Jersey police officer. The Harbourmaster and the acting Harbourmasters are those, if you like.
Is that a permanent? Is that an indefinite secondment?
Yes.
So it's a new.
He's employed by Ports of Jersey. He's actually going to be sworn in the Royal Court as a Harbourmaster on Friday.
Yeah.
But he won't be. He's not a standalone resource just doing all this policing.
No, I understand.
But he provides us a bit of the expertise, if you want to.
And in more general terms, is there going to be any anticipated workload for the police, States of Jersey Police, in any of this?
It's our belief that it will increase our demand, and in the current landscape, we do not have sufficient resources in the financial landscape to cope with the increased demand. We haven't had an uplift in resources or growth for this change in legislation.
What's the likely, what order of magnitude are we talking about, and what are the likely scenarios that you're talking about?
Well, I think the draft memorandum of understanding is divergent with the serious injury. So whether somebody's causing serious injury and it's complex in its investigation, then States of Jersey Police with the capability may have to pick that investigation up, whether they're PIP 2 qualified detective. So in those sorts of cases, it could be quite a lengthy investigation. If there's a clear glorious negligent manslaughter, a death at sea, we'd expect the States of Jersey Police to pick that up. And that comes along with quite a lengthy investigation, quite financial implications as well, and it adds to the undue pressures of our existing pressures within the police as it currently stands.
If I may say, Chair, I don't think, and in great respect, any of the offences that your rank, sorry, Chief Detective, DCI Jackson just said are relevant to this particular law, in the sense of the kind of mentioned was manslaughter, was deaths at sea. These are already issues dealt with in other laws. They're not specifically anything to do with these law changes here.
Causing serious injury while operating.
But that's already an offence. Causing serious injury on the sea is already an offence. And with regard to magnitude, as I keep pointing out, with regard to actual offences to be prosecuted, we're talking 1 or 2 in 5 years.
Let's get back to our old friend, the breathalyser. So in terms of when an incident does happen now, suspicion of careless or dangerous operation of a vessel, and a breath test may be taken, who's going to be doing that in reality? Is it possibly someone from Harbours or possibly a police officer?
Well, so I think there's 2 types of breath tests. So there's the first breath test, which is on the scene, that can't be evidence.
Yeah.
arguably that's most likely going to be the Coast Guard duty officer or the acting Harbourmaster, because they're likely to be the one who, it's likely to be somebody, we've seen somebody operating a vessel we're unhappy with. It might be the lifeguard at St Bride's Bay observing something. It's likely the duty officer is going to attend first. There's provision within the regulations for it to be a States of Jersey police officer as well. Then when it comes to the evidential breath test, so that's when, I think you call it the line meter or that.
Line intoxizer.
Yeah. That's States of Jersey police. So we would, be the original process, and then we'd have to go to the police station. Then within this process here, then States of Jersey, and we need to codify, it's in the regulations, but it needs to be codified within the MOU exactly to make sure we get that right. But that evidential breath test comes from the police station, their machine, and that the processes, which I guess a rigour behind that as well.
Are there, and so look, let's finish this element, but so there seems to be some disagreement about the resource implication and the potential uplift in work for the States of Jersey Police. Do you have any thoughts on that, Minister?
I think there needs to be some clarity and that's the whole point of the MOU, because it won't be the role of the States of Jersey Police to provide the breathalyser at the harbour or on the beach or wherever. That will be the role of the ports of Jersey. Yeah. The implication would come, obviously, with the breathalyser at police headquarters, depending on the numbers, etc., etc. The paperwork and the rest of the prosecution sits with ports of Jersey. It sits with ports of Jersey. I think the only thing is that, as Craig said, in relation to parts of it, I think what needs to be clarified potentially is that the States of Jersey have picked up those serious investigations in the past in relation to deaths within the water because of the fact that the port, I'm not probably saying something out of turn here, but the ports of Jersey wouldn't be in a position to be able to investigate that level of injury in relation to those sorts of things. So those will always probably sit with the States of Jersey Police. Yeah. I think what needs to be identified is that when these matters do occur, there might be an anticipation, and it's fine that that SOJP may take that. But I think sometimes, as with the Lagoon 2, there was an additional resource that had to be brought in order for that to be managed. And I think sometimes the costing of that and who pays for it is probably what needs to be looked at in the round, I would suggest. But that's obviously for the police to have some consultation with the ports of Jersey in relation to how that all maps out, I think is...
So I suppose a point to make then, or a question to ask rather, is although incidents at sea might be a lot rarer than on the road, when they do happen at sea, they can be much more costly in terms of certainly the scale of the accident, but also the psychological impact, but the cost at the end of the day is very expensive too. So how is any... I mean, it's not the first thing that we ask about or think about, but cost in terms of cost recovery, there's a big income stream from traffic, isn't there? There's lots of ways that we get money out of car or bike owners for the road. But what ultimately, how does Ports of Jersey get its money? And is there an argument that some of that money should be going directly to this if there are increased policing costs? Or would you argue that that's already being done to?
To me, that's what this MOU is about.
Yes.
It's about making sure that division of labour, remuneration, or if that's the right word, because that's normally wages, but where the costs lie, etc., are decided in advance.
How
to make sure that when events happen in the past, we're not having to have a discussion about how, who, where, why, that it's clearly laid out.
Is the MOU publicly available, or how would we scrutinise? And is the intention for that to just be an internal thing, or would it be?
I mean, I think it'll be a living, breathing document. Yeah. So I think it should reflect the relationship at the time. It should evolve with how things are going. Yeah. I suppose what I would say is the MOU is a two-way working relationship. States of Jersey Police are the island's experts in. I guess I don't know if policing is the right word, but a detective has a career in being a detective in the same way as a Harbourmaster has a career in being a Harbourmaster. It's certainly not Ports of Jersey's intention to put the enforcement and safe management of Jersey's waters in States of Jersey's police hands. That would be inappropriate. We are the Harbour Authority. But likewise, when a serious incident happens where somebody's life has been altered, it's appropriate that the best qualified people are able to undertake that investigation. I think, so that's what the MOU. But that point, Ports of Jersey doesn't walk away because Ports of Jersey is still the maritime expertise. And like with Lacoon, we're supporting States of Jersey Police very heavily with that investigation in terms of maritime expertise. I think something with Lacoon is so big, it's beyond almost a bit within the scope of States of Jersey Police and Ports of Jersey, things like recovery of, a salvage operation of a vessel. That comes back to a certain extent to government and they're such big activities. So I think the MOU will provide clarity of when the police will lead an investigation in terms of having that expertise, but not putting expecting States of Jersey Police to pick up Ports of Jersey's responsibility. But I think when we get into really big incidents and thankfully they don't happen at all very often, and we don't want them to happen at all, we want to prevent them, they are, I think, beyond normal scope of...
Yeah, I mean, that incident, I know it's still live in a sense, but that involved two commercial entities in it, so there was a commercial ferry and a fishing boat. And to what extent does do these amendments actually cover that, or would that kind of situation have already been covered by separate legislation?
Technically,
It would be covered by separate legislation because it's gross negligent manslaughter wouldn't fall into these amendments. But if I can go back to the MOU just to satisfy the panel, we're working with the Harbours, Ports of Jersey, with States of Jersey Police have clear lines of demarcation to know primacy and roles of responsibility at the point of reporting. With regards to cost recovery, we'll clearly have that in there with regards to if States of Jersey Police pick up an investigation, what costs would be recovered on the back of that. Clearly, if there's an unfit through drink or drugs and it's going on to line and toxicise and using the custody, that's part of the island's process and the States of Jersey Police being good partners to actually, we're not expecting Ports of Jersey to get their own custody unit, line and toxiliser to get that evidence. We're supporting there. We're an island community and want to support the safe waters and operating of vessels. So the MOU, and I think it should be open, there'll be nothing within the MOU. It should not be public facing because it's how two agencies are going to effectively work together to make sure there's a thorough investigation at the point of an incident.
I think it's really interesting. The Harbourmaster and his assistants have centennial powers. I think that also points to the honorary police in itself, and that line of policing in Jersey, that if we didn't have that level of both honorary and Harbourmaster policing, 100% of these costs and 100% of these investigations would be falling on States of Jersey Police.
But this is not being done by honoraries, just to be clear.
But I'm saying, and so
generally,
by the fact that we have a Harbourmaster system which enables that level up to the level of centennial to be dealt with within the Harbourmaster, saves the police having to deal with these incidents in itself.
Yeah, but what we're talking about here is the practicality. So initial, say, breath tests would be done on the sea, but then the follow-up for if there was a more sophisticated test, it would be done.
That's the most,
the eventual breath test would be done at a police station by a trained person within that use of the equipment. Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay, that's fine. And did you want to add anything? Because we were talking about the commercial vessels.
The only thing I will say is, I think you're right. So there was legislation outside of shipping legislation in terms of Lacoon. There was also a shipping law offence. So we have the Jersey 2002 shipping law, which generally speaking covers more commercial type activities. But in theory, operating a vessel dangerously or carelessly could apply to commercial vessels within that context. It doesn't. These regulations don't preclude that.
Okay. Thank you. Deputy Andrews?
No, not for me. No.
So can I, and let's go back to the MOU very quickly. Ministers, are you also mindful of the comments of DCI Jackson that there's no reason the MOU shouldn't be made public?
Oh, I'm not, if the two agencies are satisfied, I think it makes sense because then people are quite clear of what that is. Why does it need to be secret? Is my thing.
Thank you. So just we're going to start to wrap this session up, but clearly there may be some follow up, and certainly I think we're likely to take up the invitation of meeting with the law officers or law drafters.
Law officers.
Law officers. Yeah. Thank you. Can I just ask though? So in terms of the workload of bringing this forward, has a lot of this fallen to who's been the main driver behind this, not ministerially, but from a practical point of view?
It's been a partnership.
Yeah, so ultimately the minister is the shipping minister.
Yeah.
So for our PSOs, a lot of those responsibilities are delegated practically for administration through the Harbour Authority. So we work really well with our colleagues in economy. So again, we provide the subject matter expertise, and again with the law officers. And yeah, so I think a collaborative approach. You know, we're trying to provide what we think will work practically in terms of, you know, from keeping people safe point of view, while also not all being experts on necessarily writing laws and regulations.
Thank you. I've got a final question otherwise. The Minister, do you plan on recording dangerous offences, and so I suppose like monitoring, you know, how this these new amendments bed in, and if so, what will the data monitoring process look like?
I think that comes back to the fact the Harbour Authority already does record offences and investigations and the kind of incidents of these sorts. They compile that and they provide that as the Harbour Authority annual report. I don't think that's going to change.
No, so we'll continue to report to the Harbour and Airport Committee and to the Minister, you know, after those meetings. And then, again, if any States members are ever interested in coming to see the work of what we do in terms of, you know, Coast Guard and the enforcement part, you know, you're welcome to come along. We haven't, I must admit, to date published enforcement stats. We do publish our Coast Guard stats, but it's something potentially, if you know, you could consider.
So it's all part of the same question, but do you think that there's going to be any evolution that you anticipate in this legislation? So is there are there latent offences that you're potentially not picking up at the moment, which might be more obvious once these amendments are brought forward? Is that something you anticipate?
I think we're trying to do a broad sweep with this brush, taking in mind these regulations first came out in 2012. I think on the whole, those regulations have served us okay, but we've identified in that time a couple of weaknesses. I think these have, again, it's difficult to know, isn't it, whether, you know, what the next, I don't know what the next thing is going to be. Yes, in maritime, you know, somebody will come up with something we haven't thought about. I think broadly using careless and reckless and having one set of regulations and not being too specific, I think helps keep them broad. So hopefully, yes, will these regulations change perhaps in 10 years' time? I guess so, in the way that regulations do. But I think we're you know, these regulations will set us on a good course, you know, for that kind of period.
And Minister for SED, I think we've got a quote here from you at the last hearing saying by bringing this legislation, you're going one step down that road. I think it's to talk about, we're probably talking in the context of regulation generally and possibly in the context of breath testing and alcohol. Do you think that this is is this maybe a way of moving the conversation forward about what we expect in terms of maritime safety in a proportional way?
I think it does. I think it does move that forward. I think just in itself, giving the ability to compel a breath test, I think that measure in itself makes a difference.
So that was me who said that, actually. That's a question. I misread it. I think, but we get the point. I think.
In which case, I'd roughly agree with you.
And I think what you said is that it's about taking people along with you. So do you still?
And that's what I keep
stand
coming
by
back to. That's the proportionality element, which I just fundamentally believe in. I don't think you should make rules when there is no evidence that you need that rule to be there.
You did say that. So you said by bringing this will be one step down the road, and my question was therefore what are the next steps? So I think we found some consensus there at the end anyway. So look, I think unless there's any questions from this side of the table, have you got any questions, Minister Frost, or any points that you'd like to make, or from an officer point of view?
I'd just like to thank DCI Jackson and Deputy Hegarat for joining me in the scrutiny hearings first time this happened. So it's quite novel.
Oh no, second, we were in the...
Oh, we were, you're right. Yeah, okay, this is becoming a habit.
Online safety.
Online safety.
Yeah, well, and there are clearly always going to be areas of synergy and crossover. So, and thank you to the other.
Interesting, like you kind of pointed out, we didn't directly consult in that sense. So from that perspective, it's interesting that you found synergies that we weren't seeing ourselves.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time. We'll bring this hearing to a close and we'll ask for the